You want to know what items you're missing out on? I'm here to tell you what's the best in this list. I got you. Let's get to it. First, wait for the drop. Alright, so there's a lot of items out there that people are just flat out ignoring, and I'm here to tell you about them. And there are some real bangers in here in the later half. Now before we get to the juicy bits of the video, let's start with the most important basic craftables that many are ignoring, opening with darts. Now there are 3 types of darts you're likely going to have: Bone Dart, Poison Bone Dart, and Crystal Dart. Even though Bone Dart scales the most with Dex and Crystal Dart scales with Intellect, my Dexterity characters still did more damage with Crystal Darts than Bone Darts. Now even though Poison Darts may sound nice on paper, they're going to be made irrelevant by craftables later in this list. So for the sake of simplicity, all you care about are the Crystal Darts here. Crystal Darts not only throw far with a very fast travel speed, but one lesser known trick with Crystal Darts is that they turn statue enemies against each other after about 3 or 4 hits. Yes, this includes bosses. Having trouble with birds? Everybody loves the bird enemies in Elden Ring. I know, right up there with the wolves and dogs, but many people aren't using their resources. If you hate birds, craft these darts. They are incredibly easy to make, come in full stacks of 5 with each single craft, and will make your life a lot easier. Let's move on to consumables. Here, we're going to talk about 3 consumables in particular: Exalted Flesh, Pickled Turtleneck, and Greases. Now, Exalted Flesh is the real heavy hitter of this list. This stacks with other buffs later in the list and is a boss destroyer. As you can see here, eating Exalted Flesh takes me from about 409 damage per hit all the way up to 491 damage per hit with both weapons. That's an additional 160 damage for my build with 1 item alone. Now, this buff lasts for around 30 seconds, but this 30 seconds is potentially providing you thousands of points of additional damage during the first portion of the boss fight. Now, I'm going to consider Pickled Turtleneck as a good honorable mention as a pre-boss consumable. I don't use these myself, but after a bit of testing, they are a lot better than I thought. Unlike Exalted Flesh, these last for a full minute, so it's an easy pop it and forget it type of item. During this time, your stamina regeneration is nearly doubled, and the icing on the cake is they are ridiculously easy to make. Much easier than Exalted Flesh, so you can really have infinite of these in your inventory and not feel bad about popping them. Now, the final consumables we have here are greases. There are a load of greases, and you've likely found a recipe for at least a small handful of them. If you're using a weapon that is not amplified with a status effect like Bleed or Frost, these are always worth it to pop. Playing this way allows you to keep the stat scaling benefits of something like a Keen or heavy weapons while still gaining the additional elemental damage from the grease. For example, having a strength or dex scaling weapon with a fire grease applied on top of it ultimately adds up to much more damage than just having a flat-out fire enchanted weapon and losing out on your stat scaling. So by this point, we're starting to get to the real champs of this list. Now we are going to talk about one of the most critically underrated mechanics of the game, the cracked pots and ritual pots. Now, you've likely been picking these up as you've been running through the game and just completely ignoring them. These items are not regular consumables. It's not something where you craft it, then you have to go grind more. These items function similar to flasks where you can hold a certain amount and not have to worry about using them. Whenever you use these pots, they do not break. They stay in your inventory, and all you have to do is have the crafting materials to make whatever type of pot you want. First, we'll start with the cracked pots. Some things to keep in mind is that every damaging pot scales differently. So although some may look worse than others here, these numbers may be drastically different for you depending on your character's build. My character's main damaging stat is Dexterity, so for me, lightning pots were the most effective by leaps and bounds. The damage output on lightning pots was insane, considering that I can carry 14 more of these and they are incredibly easy to craft. Volcano pot deserves an honorable mention because I'd imagine you can cluster bigger groups of enemies in this than a normal pot. I'd still recommend only making these cracked pots for big single target damage on bosses over dealing with regular mobs. Now, the real stars of the show here are the poison and fetid pots. Now, both poison and fetid pot serve the same purpose. So you might ask, what's the difference between the two? Poison applies a weaker damaging poison over a longer period of time of around 90 seconds, while fetid pots apply a stronger ticking poison over a shorter period of time of 30 seconds. The regular poison may do more damage if the full 90 seconds elapses, but considering that most boss fights will be over by that time, I'd consider using the fetid pot 100% of the time over poison pot. Now, oil pots are a weird one. All it does is amplify your next instance of fire damage by about 25%, but it only works on a single instance. This can apply to pyromancies and weapon fusions as well if you're running a build that incorporates these. I don't think I would ever recommend using a full cracked pot slot just for a single instance damage buff. The two huge MVPs here are the fetid pot and whatever potion best scales with your stats. For me and my dexterity build, lightning pots are my big damage dealers. As you can see here, I can melt one of these Kaled dogs easily with just these consumables alone. This can be great for big, big, safe damage on bosses while maintaining a distance. Now, ritual pots are more rare than cracked pots. As you can see, I can only hold about 5 currently, whereas the cracked pots I could hold around 14. Because of this, for the most part, they are just strictly better versions of cracked pots. Considering that cracked pots were already very good, this can be huge. For ritual pots, I wouldn't recommend the damaging pots at all. That's what cracked pots are for. The real MVPs here are the freezing pot and the rot pot. The freezing pot applies an initial damage, but more importantly, applies frostbite. What frostbite does is it increases the damage that enemy takes by 20%. This is huge for bosses, and this is where it all really comes together. The huge strength to both cracked and ritual pots is that they apply any status effect instantly. We can open any boss fight with Rot Pot, Fetid Pot, and Freezing Pot to have the boss take 20% damage for the rest of the fight, as well as have an enormous amount of ticking poison damage over time. Now, Rot Pot and Freezing Pot are all that we care about here. Honestly, if you want damaging consumables, just use the cracked pots. Now, the real unsung heroes of unused crafting items are aromatic perfumes. I went through most of the game not even knowing these existed. Unlike the pots that are fairly straightforward and go boom boom, big damage, yay, or a debuff, perfumes all have drastically different effects and can be very versatile. If you're a Dex build, Spark Aromatic does huge damage. 1200 frontal AoE damage is nothing to scoff at. And we're to my personal favorite consumable, Uplifting Aromatic. Use Uplifting Aromatic. This thing's a double whammy because 1, it gives you a shield that fully absorbs a hit similar to the Wondrous Flask shield. For the record, that alone would already be a good enough reason for me to recommend you this item. But on top of that, it also gives a 10% all-around damage buff that stacks with other damage buffing consumables. Providing both attack and defense with no drawbacks is absolutely incredible. The buff also lasts around 40 seconds, which is significant. Now, Iron Jar Aromatic is a bit of a meme. You consume this and you pretty much turn into a raid boss. You lose a lot of mobility with this though, and large enemies can still knock you around, so I don't know if I'd ever recommend this outside of just having fun. It is definitely the most fun to use from my experience. Blood Boil Aromatic is strictly a damage buff and a huge one. As you can see, I go the whole way from my previous damage of 409 up to 531 damage, but it comes with the huge downside of making you take a load of increased damage by lowering all of your defenses. Considering the strategy is to stay alive as long as you can to get the most out of your rotten fetid pots, I recommend Uplifting Aromatic over this any day of the week due to Uplifting being all benefits, no drawbacks. Also, I found that Blood Boil does not stack with other power increasing consumables like Exalted Flesh, while Aromatic can. Poison Spray Mist, absolute trash. You are very limited on perfume bottles. As you can see, I only have 4. Do not use a slot on one of these. Seriously, if you want to poison enemies, just throw a poison cracked pot. Acid Spray Mist serves a similar purpose to Frost in the sense that it's a debuff. Frost makes the enemies take 20% more damage, while Acid makes them deal 15% less damage. This is another one I wouldn't really recommend. I'd take a Spark Aromatic over this any day of the week and definitely an Uplifting over it. So the top 2 picks here are easily Uplifting Aromatic and Spark Aromatic. Blood Boil deserves an honorable mention at number 3 if you're willing to take that risk for bigger damage, but honestly, Uplifting Aromatic is all you need here. If you used all of your perfume bottles on only Uplifting Aromatic, I would say you're making the right choice. Now, if we apply everything we've learned here for a rough example of how this would affect a fight, we can pop Lightning Grease, Uplifting Aromatic, and Exalted Flesh to make sure the boss music is no longer playing for your enemy, but playing for you. You might want to pick a theme song because once you walk into a boss room, it is only your music playing from this point forward. We up our damage here from 533 the whole way up to 789 on a single weapon. If you apply this to a dual wield build, it is over. As always, appreciate the watch. Like the video, subscribe if you like the content because this took a lot of effort. Have a good one.